Hi everyone. In this video, we begin section 2, developing an enterprise architecture in the Bernard text. And this section is about how to accomplish and implement an enterprise architecture. And it really looks at this from a methodology and a framework. And we begin with the methodology in this chapter. But section 2 covers what is an EA framework. It presents this step-by-step 20-step methodology to implement an EA. It discusses how to document current and future views of enterprise architecture and describes how to articulate the enterprise architecture in an EA management plan. Those are topics that are covered in all of section 2. Enterprise architecture, the act of doing enterprise architecture, really the act of doing, the outcome for the act of doing enterprise architecture is a set of models. So we will talk about modeling a lot, and in the certificate and in the MPS master's degree, you take a course on EA modeling. It's fundamental to enterprise architectures, how we represent the analysis of the work of enterprise architects. So in chapter 4, we talk about the implementation methodology. And the learning objectives are to understand the purpose of an EA methodology, to understand the steps of an example EA methodology, and understanding the relationships between the EA framework and the methodology. So let's just start with the framework. An EA framework is the structure for organizing this information, the information that often is represented through models and that sits in the repository, the EA repository. The framework defines the scope of the architecture. What are we including? What aren't we including? It is what the EA program will document. It describes what it will document, what it will include, and the relationships between the various areas of architecture. So there are different areas of architecture, for example, business architecture, application architecture, technology and infrastructure architecture, etc. So now the EA implementation methodology, which we will refer to as the EA methodology for short, it defines how the EA will be established and run. So Bernard, in his 20-step process, it's a generic process, which is great because you can apply these steps in any startup, EA startup situation. It is a step-by-step procedure for establishing, maintaining, and using a framework, and it is how the documentation will be developed and archived and used. It includes the selection of the framework and modeling tools and the online repository. So different methodologies, for instance, TOGAF, the Open Group Architecture Framework, DODAF, FIAF. These are topics that we have come across so far in this course. And so that's what this methodology is. This is a generic methodology, as I said, which Bernard puts forth in this chapter. So the basic elements of the EA documentation, we can look at the current architecture and the future architecture. So again, I've created these PowerPoints, nothing sexy here. I've just grabbed some of these figures from the text. And we have these components, vertical and horizontal, and these components translate into how we represent those components, and that is this EA documentation. These are artifacts. So the EA methodology is like designing and constructing a home. So the steps. Put this back here. The role of an EA framework within an EA methodology. So we have this methodology. Here are the steps that we're going to follow. The EA framework, it builds the structure for organizing the information. It defines the scope, how EA will be implemented, and determine what we will be documenting. Bernard's EA implementation methodology, as I said, is a 20-step process and is an example of EA implementation that contains all of the general steps that would support the creation of a new comprehensive EA program. So many students say, we don't have an EA program in our company. How do we go about starting it? Well, Chapter 4 is about those situations where you want to start an EA program. For revitalizing an existing EA program or switching approaches, you would need to add steps in Phase 1 and or Phase 2. Bernard paints an ideal picture. Just remember, it is an ideal picture, but it's a good generic overview. If the world were perfect, here's how it would work. So Phase 1, establishing the EA program. This pre-documentation activities help ensure that the program has goals and is focused. Phase 1 activities include get the EA program initially started, identify key players, and communicate the EA implementation plan to the executive sponsors and stakeholders. You want to gain buy-in and support in this phase. Here are the 4 steps. I won't go through the steps. You can read those yourselves. I will just go through in this PowerPoint audio the phases and how they fit together. So in Phase 2, once we kick off things in Phase 2, the EA framework and tool selection occurs. So Phase 2 activities occur when the initial set of the EA documentation is developed. Begins with the selection of the documentation framework. It identifies the scope of the architecture, as we said, and it guides techniques for modeling the current and future views. Remember, so the analysis that the architects do, the enterprise architects do, the results of that analysis are captured in models. And these artifacts, these models, must be stored someplace, and they're stored in the EA repository. So the framework helps in identifying the scope of the architecture and the techniques that will be used for modeling the current and the future. This is part and parcel of the methodology, but they're 2 separate things. The methodology is the how-to, and the framework is the what. So a key term here is the EA artifact. An EA artifact is a documentation product such as a text document, a system spec, an application interface diagram, a spreadsheet, any of these artifacts. So here are the steps 5 through 10 that are included in Phase 2. In Phase 3 is where the documentation of the enterprise architecture occurs. Phase 3 activities are where the actual development of the EA occurs in the form of these documentation artifacts. And now you analyze and document the current strategy, the business information, services, and infrastructure, those different levels, vertical levels of the components. You develop artifacts that reflect changes in the resources in the short term. So remember, we're moving from the current state to the future state in order to support strategic initiatives which support the strategy, right? So remember this alignment. So to move from the current to the future, we have to, what do we have to do in the short term? What do we have to do in the long term? Activities conclude with the development of the management plan. How are we getting from the current to the future? The management plan summarizes the current and future views and provides the roadmap for transitioning and sequencing from short-term to long-term changes. And here are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 steps for Phase 3. In phase 4 is the use and maintenance of the enterprise architecture. So in phase 4 is the ongoing set of activities that promotes the use of EA information by all stakeholders. It's not good enough just to document these things and put them in the repository. People have to know how to access them, right? So in the early days, Zachman really is, the Zachman framework really is a repository, and filling in all the cells in this repository. And that's great, but it's of no use to anyone other than the people that model it if no one knows or understands how to access the information and use it. Phase 4 establishes an annual cycle for updates. This is where the value of the EA program is realized as planning and decision-making throughout the enterprise are supported, we hope. Value is maintained through regular updates of the current and future views of the architecture because, just like in anything else, garbage in, garbage out. If your documentation isn't maintained, that means it's not accurate, and what good is it then? So value is also gained in the maintenance of the EA repository. And here are the steps. So I believe, what is the purpose of phase 1? It is EA program establishment, right? And these just run through some of the focus questions that you were assigned. You can look at these on your own, but that's really the methodology in a nutshell. And this chapter really gives you in a perfect world, these are the things that happen. This is the way it should happen. This is how you get an EA started in your company. Talks about the executive sponsor and the chief architect. Here's the difference between outcome-driven EA versus traditional EA. So we've talked about outcome-driven EA, or we are talking about outcome-driven EA. Traditional EA focuses on this standard EA framework like Zachman. It's driven by documentation, artifacts, and delivering products. Outcome-driven EA moves architects away from what enterprise architects do to focus on the deliverables that are driven by measurable business outcomes. So in the beginning, in the first, first decade or two of EA, EA got a bad name because it was seen as something to just document everything. Let's document the current state. And that could take years. And so just by documenting the current state, business owners didn't get value from that. And so EA got a bad rap. This move from what I will call traditional boil the ocean approach to an outcome-driven EA is, let's see where we're going to get the value. Let's document that, and let's only drill down when we need it. And so it's much more cognizant of the need to provide value and not years away in the future. So this outcome-driven EA, Gartner is big on this, as they should be. It moves architects away from boiling the ocean to finding out what do we need to do in order to deliver value to our stakeholders. And that's it for Chapter 4 in a nutshell. Thanks for listening.